Hello, I am Jeff Rau. I'm the Gallery Director and Public Arts Curator here at Biola University. And today joining me is artist Olga Lah, who is based in Long Beach, California. And the occasion for our conversation here is actually a temporary public art installation that Olga created for the Biola University campus this spring. It's an installation called Burst that has been installed in the trees over the walkway in front of the library, which we will perhaps talk about in a moment. But just by way of introduction, Olga is a studio artist, as I mentioned, based in Long Beach, California. She received a studio art degree from UC Riverside and a master's in theology from Fuller, and has had a number of exhibitions recently in the LA area, including exhibitions at LACE, LA Contemporary Exhibitions, at La Mag, the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. You had an installation, I think, at the LA Art Fair recently, and at ACMA, the Orange County Museum of Art. So lots of exciting things happening with your studio practice. We're excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So as I mentioned, we have this temporary installation which has been installed in the trees over the walkway in the library, and that was partly supported by the CCCA, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that came to be, but also I think funded partially through a grant from the Arts Council for Long Beach. Mm-hmm. And by way of description, I thought it might be interesting to go back to sort of the beginning of that project and the proposal that you had given us back in early 2015, I think it was. So this project has been actually some time in the making.
Right.
And your original proposal described the work this way, that Burst would consist of clusters of pool noodles hung over the length of the pathway in front of the university library, creating an active, vibrant walking experience. The work is an expression focusing on the idea of transformation, one of the three core values that Biola expounds. Materially, the installation continues your interest in commonplace objects, using commonplace objects and transforming them into works that question perception and value. And conceptually, the installation engages with the context of the walkway, inviting passerby to consider an altered experience and observe their overall surroundings with a critical perspective.
Yeah.
So, do you want to sort of expound on that, or give us a little bit of the maybe inspiration for this work, or where the concept initially came from?
Sure. When I was first walking around the campus looking for a few sites to think about some art proposals for, I immediately thought of the walkway as a possibility in front of the walkway in front of the library, because it had so much foot traffic, and I thought this would be a great place to engage with so many people. There's so many students and professors walking around, so I thought that would be a great opportunity to do something interesting there. I decided to use the pool noodles because they've been sitting in my studio for a while. They originally went up for an installation, I think back in 2011 or 2012, and in that case, it went up in an empty storefront window, and it was up for a summer. It was meant to kind of bring some vitality to that street where a lot of businesses were closing down. And then since then
Was that in Pasadena?
Pasadena,
is that right?
Yeah, it was at the Playhouse District.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was just kind of when the economy was kind of in that down period, and so a lot of empty businesses. And
was that with the Phantom Galleries project, or was that independent of?
Independent, yeah. I was working with a student at Fuller Seminary who was in touch with the Playhouse District, and they were interested in creating public works. And
Yeah, I know there were a lot of similar projects in that time that were looking to activate those vacant storefront spaces. A lot of downtown areas were really suffering through the economy, and so that was your solution to kind of bringing some vitality and some interest, some visual life to that street. It was all this kind of colorful, fun, playful filling of the space with the pool noodles.
Yeah, it was summertime. I live right by a 99-cent store. There were all these pool noodles out, and I thought this would be so fun to use. So that's how the idea came about. I was also using this fencing wire that I got from Home Depot. I was using that a lot in my work, and I thought it would be so simple to take these pool noodles and just plop them into the fencing. And so I just ended up framing the window a little bit with these giant forms of pool noodles, and yeah, it was a fun piece. And then it probably went up one more time in a gallery, and then since then it just was sitting around in my studio. So yeah.
So for this iteration, as you mentioned, the previous installations, they were largely sort of in corners of galleries or in the store window where the sort of pool noodles almost were these spires, these sort of stalactites and stalagmites, creating a colorful kind of framing, almost like a cave space in those particular spaces. But what we have here at Biola is a little bit different formulation of that.
Yeah.
It's rather than sort of growing out of the walls and the corners, there are these sort of self-contained, just explosions of color suspended overhead.
Yeah, which was somewhat new for me because I often work against walls or in corners and there's some kind of support. But in this case, I had proposed that I was going to create these standalone pieces that were going to hang. And so it just was a matter of taking the whole piece apart, cutting up the fencing down and creating these spherical forms, and then plopping, again, the pool noodles into the slots. And it was a risky venture. I wasn't sure exactly how it was going to turn out. You know, there was a lot of planning and conjecture involved, but it seemed like it's holding up well.
Yeah.
I think 2 months later since we put it up.
Yeah, it has actually held up remarkably well. We've had several big storms come through, and I have to say I was a little nervous about how well they would hold up outside. I mean, obviously the foam itself is weather resistant, but the constructions themselves have held up pretty well through some high winds, and it's really it's sort of fun to watch them swing in the wind.
Yeah, I would love to see that. Actually.
They have a life to them that as opposed to sort of sitting dormant against the corners, they do move with the trees.
Yeah, I'm glad for that. Yeah, it brings some attention to the piece for sure. And it's swaying.
And you mentioned the planning. That was one of the things I thought might be interesting for people to know. Even though this is a temporary installation, it really has been in the works for a little while.
Right.
You mentioned to me previously that probably back around 2014, I think it was, Barry Kramis with the CCCA had approached you about maybe creating a temporary public art installation for the campus that would be supported partly by the CCCA. And so that invitation was part of the initial sort of impetus for this. But then there was a whole process of seeking potential funding for that, and you, as I mentioned, applied for a grant with the Arts Council for Long Beach, which you then received. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And but also part of the original proposal was working with our internal University Public Art Committee, and the original proposals that you had put through, which I read partly from earlier, actually included 3 possibilities. And I know that you wanted to be sensitive to our needs as a community and have input from the Biola community as to which maybe would be the most engaging or appropriate for our context. So Burst, the pool noodle suspended in the trees overhead, was one of those proposals, but the other 2 were, I believe, looking at I guess you might say decorating the exterior of the Rose of Sharon Chapel, which is a small little prayer chapel immediately adjacent to the library that is a really intimate space, and I think a lot of times gets dwarfed and almost lost in the scale of the larger buildings that have been built up around it. It seemed to me like maybe part of your hope with that particular proposal was to call attention to this intimate little space and its association with the Rose of Sharon. And then there was another one that, again, focused largely on the walkway in front of the library, but rather than something overhead, it was sort of inscribing, or it might have been a vinyl application or something, but poetry running the kind of length of the walkway, that it would be a sort of embodied progression to experience that work, to walk through it and to read these poems. So that diversity of different approaches was also something that we considered, me being a part of that committee, and ultimately landed on Burst. But I don't know if you wanted to maybe touch on some of the inspirations for the other pieces, what maybe intrigued you about those spaces or those other approaches that might have been interesting for us?
Yeah. I think what you were saying about the Rose of Sharon Chapel, is that the correct name of the building? Yeah, what you were saying about it being kind of this unassuming building amongst all these taller, larger structures around it really drew me in. It just was this curious little place where the students or other Biola community were invited to come and sit and pray. And I remember going in there and sitting, and it felt very emotional in there. There were a lot of students crying, and a few students also praying, kind of whispering. And so I think that really drew me in, because for me, silence and prayer are so essential to my life, to my practice. And so I think just personally I was drawn to this space, but and I originally wanted to do something inside, but I thought, no, this is a place where people are coming to pray. I don't want to distract from that. And so I thought, well, let's do something on the outside, because I do like to engage with architectural structures. And so I thought, what could we do? And I like this idea of, bringing some almost like blow up flowers, blow up roses, and then attaching them somehow to the building. And right, like as you were saying, just calling attention to this place, not only as as an aesthetic interest, but just also a place of, this is a place of prayer, and come and sit and be here and be silent. It really was thinking about it as an invitation. It's
interesting to me that you would describe it in this way of sort of like being an invitation to prayer, because I think the materials that you work with so often don't have that immediate association. I mean, you're just talking about using potentially inflatable sort of flower forms, the constructions with pool noodles. I mean, these are very kind of ordinary, commonplace, industrial, commercial products and material. It's not the type of thing that you would associate with, prayer and contemplation initially. Yeah. But can you maybe speak to that, like how? I mean, maybe I have some ideas about how that works in your work. I think it does have that other kind of layer of engagement, but that's not your immediate association with the descriptions or the maybe even the sort of skin of the work. But how do you think that works? That those then become an invitation to something deeper. That these sort of pedestrian materials become an invitation to deeper contemplation.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I'm a very contemplative person. I need a lot of silence and solitude in my life. And in my work, I didn't start out that very long ago. I started out as an artist maybe 6 years ago professionally. And what I wanted for my work was to create that space of meditation, of reflection, of quietness. And for whatever reason, I mean, I have some things I can share with you, but for whatever reason, my work ended up being very colorful and very loud and very exciting. But at the heart of it, at the foundation, I think, of that work is me being in my studio, being quiet, praying and thinking and waiting. And as far as trying to draw people into that place with my work, that invitation is always there, that opportunity, that desire is always there for people to come. But if people have different responses to it, if they're excited by it, if they're inspired by it, that's great too. If it's just if it's just a joyful experience for them, that's totally fine. But I think one of my kind of theories of why it's just so big and so colorful is that it comes from this place of just sitting quietly and joy arising out of that. I think in my quiet time, I'm thinking a lot about, my personal struggles, being sad or angry or whatever. And then once that's sort of settled into that place, I think this sense of joy and vibrancy wants to come out in the work. And so, with the Rose of Sharon, it was a bright proposal. It was something fun. But in that case, I really liked that proposal because it was an invitation to come inside that building and to have a very tangible experience of, this is a place where you could actually sit and pray. Whereas a lot of my work, the sponges and the paper, you can walk through the space, there are other people around. So there's not that much of a chance to do that. But with that,
so this was something that sort of on the outside calls your attention, draws you in, but then as you mentioned before, like on the interior of that space, you didn't want to distract from the function of it. And so I like that word of invitation, which I know you mentioned a lot, that I think your work very much does that. It draws you in, it invites you as a viewer to, and some of that is through the color and the sort of unusual materials where there's a certain kind of curiosity and wonder that just draws you in as a viewer initially. And perhaps then gives you the opportunity, once you're there, once it's captured your attention, you can you start to kind of explore it. Maybe you see your environment in a way that you haven't before, calling attention to spaces that had been just sort of passed through. I know that was one of the things you talked about previously with regard to the walkway in front of the library, that there was a lot of activity, but it really was it was a pass-through space. It wasn't a destination per se. And so part of your hope was to like reactivate that space and have people become more intimately aware of their immediate surroundings, engage with it in a new way. Places that they pass by and don't think about, suddenly there's a disruption that causes them to think about it differently. And that hopefully that then can actually shape your engagement with that space moving forward.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You said it very well. Those are all my goals for the piece person, also for the other proposal where I was planning on writing outlines from this poem that I had picked out. And it's this desire to want to change up a place and to invite people to look at things differently, not only in that immediate space, but in their lives. And I know these are big goals and that this isn't always going to manifest in everybody's lives, but I think what art does is that, if you're engaged with some art, a lot of art, that over time, that it does shape you, that it does change the way you think, that it makes you think critically about the conversations that you have, the way that culture is being shaped. So,
I think one of the things that I strive for as an artist myself, and maybe the way that I like to talk about that idea is creating artwork that's generous to your viewer. There's a lot of, in contemporary art dialogue, a skepticism of beauty, maybe even a certain a skepticism, or there's a lot of emphasizing the skin of things in the kind of commercial space, but then they're intentionally sort of hollow. You know what I mean? Like there's all these glossy, pretty things that are sort of intentionally banal and don't have another layer of sort of depth to them, and that's, I think, the critical impulse, the hope to be. Or the impulse by artists to be critical of our contemporary society and ask questions about the things that we unthinkingly consume and all this kind of thing. There's a place for that, but a lot of artists then are totally skeptical of offering that sort of space for deeper contemplation. And I always think that art, really, the best art perhaps, really can do both. It can be both kind of beautiful and engaging and curious and instill a sense of wonder, colorful and inviting. And if you want to appreciate it solely on that level, like, that's okay. And some of your audience is never going to get past that. But you, through that opportunity, you're also inviting a deeper level of engagement for those that are willing to kind of sit with it for a little bit, are willing to kind of listen and to look anew at their surroundings. It's both kind of generous to your audience in the sense that it draws them in with something exciting and visually just engaging, but it's also generous in the sense that the more time you spend with it, the more opportunities there are to kind of see things anew, and perhaps be shaped by that.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what I hope for my work. Yeah, I want to just be like, hey, I'm here, color, form and different kind of material. And then if people want to go deeper, if they want to discover more, then that's there if they want to.
One of the things that's core to that, as you alluded to, is the materials that you work with. So we already mentioned the pool noodles and maybe in the proposal of some inflatable flowers, but working with these kinds of materials is something you've been doing a lot of.
Yeah.
And in your proposal here for Burst, and I think it's true really across your practice, you mentioned the concept of transformation. And how that transformative process, taking something that is cheap or discarded, and then kind of through your practice, your studio practice, creating something unique and something deeper. That seems to be core to what you are doing as an artist. That transformative, I guess, impulse. I don't know if there's anything specific you wanted to add. I think maybe I commented on that more than I intended in asking the question. I don't know if there's a question
really
there.
Well to my work.
But,
Well, it really started out because I had limited funds to buy things, and so I was going to thrift stores and the 99-cent store and the Dollar Tree store just to find things that were interesting and cheap. It also started because I was looking at other artists who were using very commonplace materials like Lynn Aldrich or Tara Donovan, and just the idea of taking just something so simple and all you had to do was just, build upon. I mean, you needed to have, of course, like
a lot of scale.
Yeah, yeah, the scale. I mean, you really needed the concept of what you wanted to build and all of that, but it all just seemed so attainable, and so I wanted to try it out in my own practice, and that interest has just kind of continued, and it's become this very strong theme in my work. I realized that I like using things that already exist out there in reality. I'm not interested in coming up with a new object, I guess. I want to use things that are already pre-manufactured and out there that I can just kind of take and not have to do a lot of manipulation with, but instead to come up with new ways of construction using something that would ordinarily be used in a household or, in the library or something. Yeah. So
the pool noodles themselves are kind of an interesting choice in that regard. I don't know if you know sort of the history of the beginning of the pool noodle, but I think they were originally the gentleman that's sort of credited with inventing the pool noodle as we know it today. Essentially had a business making these foam tubes that were used as like insulators in sort of between gaps in construction or in industrial purposes. Like they just needed things to be able to seal up holes that they would just stuff it full of these like long tubular foam shapes. And because that was their business, they had a whole bunch of them around the house, and he was struck that his kids loved playing with them in the pool. So, originally for the industrial purposes, they were all black and gray and that kind of thing. But he started just from the inspiration of like his kids taking these things that were designed initially for this industrial purpose, and then finding them really engaging with it in this whole other playful way. He was like, this is great, we'll share this with the world, and started kind of publishing or making them in all kinds of bright colors and advertising them as play toys. But that really wasn't what the original design was intended for. So the pool noodle itself sort of has that history in it of this kind of transformative engagement of one object finding a new purpose and kind of a new life in a new context.
That's fascinating. So. And then you go to a website like Pinterest, and then you see all these ideas about
things that people can do,
craft projects or in school.
Transformational things.
Yeah, that's right.
Sure.
Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to maybe touch on as well, we mentioned it at the beginning that you have a master's in theology, which is a somewhat unconventional approach for a studio artist to receive first a bachelor's degree in studio art and then to go on and get a master's in theology before coming back to the studio.
Sure.
And I know you've had sort of an interesting journey as an artist that might be, I think it would be really interesting for those, and especially maybe even young artists that are still trying to find their feet, to maybe hear some of your journey.
Sure.
So what was it that brought you from studio art into a master's in theology, and then what ultimately maybe inspired you to come back into the studio?
Back into the studio. Well, I entered college as a studio art major. I added the art history major to my degree, so it was a double major, and that was for practical reasons. I decided that I wanted to go into art education, to work in the museum or work in public policy, and the goal was to get into Harvard and get my master's in art education, and I did get in and was planning on going to Harvard to get that degree, but just family circumstances, because of that I had to stay in California. And so I decided to leave any kind of art career behind, and kind of found myself saying, now what? And decided quickly to enter into seminary. So
I know you mentioned to me earlier that at the time you sort of felt like God was closing a door, and that must have meant something. That you could have perhaps pursued schooling here in Southern California to continue that sort of path, but that maybe you felt like at the time the Lord was saying, like, no, I want you to do something else at least for a time.
Yeah.
And that led you to take up a seminary to study.
It was such a crushing blow to not go to Harvard, because that was such a dream of mine. And so I thought, this must be a God thing. This must be God saying, no, this was vanity. So you need to leave this behind and do something that's worthy, of my name, something that that you could do well in. And at the time, I thought that would be to go to seminary and figure out what I could make a career out of, with that degree. So while I was there, I thought I would, get my PhD and teach church history, and then that sort of fell flat. To be honest, I did struggle at seminary, and it's no surprise now when I think back, because that decision to enter in was so rushed. And so...
but ultimately it was some coursework through Fuller that led you...
That brought me back.
Back to your studio practice.
Art. So what happened is I finished out and got my degree in theology, and ended up going back into arts administration. So I was working a few jobs in that. And I was moving around a bit, was back in LA, and didn't have a job at the time, so I decided to audit some courses at Fuller, and decided to take William Jernus's Art and Theology course. I only took one Art and Theology course while I was at Fuller, when I was a student there, and that was great. That was my favorite class, so that's so telling to me now. But I took Jernus's course, and it was really eye-opening. It was the first time I started having a conversation in my mind about what art means in a reality that is informed by divinity. And I was always good at art as a kid, as a child, but I never understood the purpose of it. What's the purpose of this? You know, what is this doing for the kingdom? You know, what am I doing with this as a Christian? So when I took Journess's class and we were having all these great conversations about historical art, contemporary art, and what that all kind of means in this intersection of faith and art. And that was exciting. And it was also the first time in about 10 years that I had made any art. And so that was also very, there was something in me that shifted. And so.
Was that part of the course, or just that you were sort of inspired on your own to go back into the studio? It was part of the coursework to create.
There was some class time where we had to do some still life sketches and things like that. I decided to take another class with Journess in Orvieto, Italy. And instead of doing a final paper, I asked Journess if I could instead create an artwork, and he agreed. And so that was probably my first like major piece of art that I had made in a really long time. And
sort of rekindled that creative spirit.
It did, in a way that I wasn't expecting at all. I had never wanted to be an artist. I never thought that was in the cards. That was not for me. I never thought I was good enough. And so I was seriously.
It was interesting that you said, even just a little bit ago, that moving through that initially, like the Bachelor in Studio Art, like you didn't feel like that was maybe worthy, that there was, that it was always, maybe there was value in artistic practice as an individual, but the vocation of an artist was, it seemed to be something that you sort of questioned the value of, that art always had to have another purpose, that like creating artwork for its own sake maybe was somehow vain. But it wasn't until that later sort of experience that perhaps you started to see that in a new light.
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, I'm always purpose-driven, and you know, my perspective has also just been informed about American culture. It's also informed because I'm a Korean American, and my parents always expected me to do something was supposed to come out of it. And so to make art, I thought, well, if I go into art education, I'm teaching. Or if I had also thought about being a graphic designer for a little bit. If I'm a designer, then I'm making something, it's going out, and it's doing something out there in the world. But just to be a visual artist, I thought, well, you make things. And what do these things do? What is it about these things? And one of the things that I realized, it started in Journess's class, but it's kind of evolved over time, is that, you know, we are making things, and they don't last. The work that I do is temporary. It lasts for this very short time, and that's okay with me, because I feel like it is affecting this world, this eternal worldview, and that it's causing these sort of reverberations that even though the work is away, the spirit of it, the experience of it, the effects of it continue on. I think
for your audience, that you're creating an experience that's hopefully transformative in some way for your audience.
That's what I believe, and somehow also in this world of ours, if you know, I feel like the spiritual world condenses time and space, where it's no longer linear, that it's becoming this whole thing. And so if I'm believing in that, then it's okay that if I'm putting up an artwork for a weekend and bringing it down, that it's still existing, it's still continuing on, it's never ended, it's just continuing. And so that's such a beautiful idea to me, that everything that we do and everything that we make and all the conversations that we have, that it all matters. It's all just not for nothing. And that brought so much hope to me, and it was a huge light bulb. So that's what brought me back into the studio, because I felt, it doesn't necessarily have to have this concrete, tangible purpose. It's something that's everlasting and that's continuing on. So, yeah.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you had that sort of awakening and were able to come back around and gift us with some of your work for this time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having my work.
Yeah. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you all for watching. And please click on one of our other cultural conversations for some other enriching conversations in the arts with the CCCA. Thank you.